to introduce our speaker, Professor Gerard Bradley. He's a professor of law at Notre Dame, and where he teaches legal ethics and constitutional law. At Notre Dame, he directs with John Finnis the Natural Law Institute and co-edits at the same time the American Journal of Jurisprudence, an international forum for legal philosophy. Professor Bradley has been a visiting fellow at the Hoover Institution of Stanford University and a senior fellow of the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton, New Jersey. He served for many years as president of the Fellowship of Catholic Scholars. Professor Bradley received his B.A. and J.D. degrees from Cornell University, graduating summa cum laude from the law school in 1980. After serving in the Title Division of the Manhattan District Attorney's Office, he joined the University of Illinois. He moved in Champaign. He moved to Notre Dame in 1992. Professor Bradley has published over 100 scholarly documents and reviews, and his most recent books include two. One is a collection of essays titled Challenges to Religious Liberty in the 21st Century, and also a volume of essays on Catholic social teaching, which he also co-edited. Today we are so fortunate because this is a really optimistic topic. I mean, the optimism is that he's going to be telling us about fertile ground for our tilling after the abortion, looking at the abortion landscape after Dobbs. So once again, the abortion landscape after Dobbs, the fertile ground for our tilling will be the topic of Professor Bradley's talk. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for the introduction. Please don't hesitate to keep eating. I'm used to it. In fact, I spent probably 25 years trying to be heard at the dinner table over the din of 8 children eating, and my wife trying to eat, so I'm used to it. Students sometimes bring food to class, but they at least eat quietly. But at our house, it was crowd control was the issue at dinner time. So please do. And I don't know, I didn't pick the title. I mean, I agreed to talk about abortion and where the abortion debate or struggle is now. But the part about tilling fertile ground, I didn't think of that. I think Kevin White, who's had the sense not to be here today, picked that title. I'm not sure if I'm suited. I did live in Champaign for 9 years. I mean, I feel like I'm part of your group, that is to be a Catholic citizen of Illinois, because I was one for 9 years. And I observed around Champaign that there seemed to be a lot growing in the fields. People told me, and I'm willing to accept it, that it was soy and corn. But I don't know anything about tilling fertile ground or otherwise. I'm a city kid. I grew up the son of a cop in Brooklyn, so we didn't have anything green around. There was no grass, none of that sort of thing. So, but anyway, I'm very pleased to be here, even though it was a longer drive than I thought it would be. It rained all the way from South Bend, and probably will rain all the way home. So, I did agree to talk about, abortion and where the political and legal argument is, and it was really a difficult, or more than usually difficult talk to prepare. And maybe the main reason, one reason for sure, is that there's a lot going on, and in whatever space I can take for prepared remarks, maybe a half hour or 35 minutes, I have to pick and choose what to focus on and what to talk about. So I do want to leave time for questions and conversation. So I had to be a pretty ruthless editor when getting around to what to talk about. But the other reason is that it's a moving target. I mean, I first was contacted by our absent friend Kevin White in January to come over. Actually wanted me to come over in January, although I couldn't. But at that time, he had seen something I had written and published in the National Catholic Register, I think in mid-December, about the fight over abortion in state courts. And I'll have a little bit to say about that. And I thought that would be pretty much what I would talk about. But as the time went from January, February to March, a lot of other things started to happen. And they keep happening. So the topic is a bit of a moving target. Just last night, our president declared in the State of Union address, I think his phrase was, restore Roe. And he emphasized that. Now that's, I mean, I know what he means, and it's not mysterious, and I'm not faulting him for his choice of language, but he's not talking about stacking the Supreme Court, and then somewhere down the line, a liberal majority of the court would actually restore Roe. What he means is that he's going to do whatever he can, I guess, to get Congress to pass something like the Women's Health Protection Act of 2020, which would actually, and I'm sure the legislation he has in mind, if he has anything in mind, would be more than restoring Roe. I mean, the legislation that the National Democratic Party would pass, if they could, would do more than restore Roe. In other words, even under Roe, as you'll remember, there are various ways in which abortion could be regulated. You could beef up, well, maybe many of you have been worked on that kind of thing for years. You could work against Roe and limit it around the edges on informed consent and admitting privileges. And after Casey, you could limit abortion in the third trimester, probably just to cases where a woman's life or physical health was endangered. But what the Democrats have in mind is the full thing. It's just free abortion. There's no restrictions. I mean, it's hard to imagine what no restrictions looks like, but that's what they seem to be saying. So restoring Roe is one heck of a thing to contemplate. But it's a moving target. What I would say about, let's say two things about state court action after Dobbs. I mean, the Supreme Court famously returned the issue to the states. You could read the Dobbs opinion from front to back, back to front, and then do the same thing over and over again. And you would see no evidence that the state courts should be doing anything at all. Whenever Dobbs, the Supreme Court majority, talked about what would be coming, they always talked about returning the issue to the people and their elected representatives. That's what the case uniformly says. And you might say, well, why are there judges, state judges, doing anything at all since they're not elected representatives? But no matter what, or make what you wish of Dobbs's language, there's no doubt the Supreme Court had no intention or didn't even have the power to exclude state courts interpreting the state constitution or state statutes. And there's been a lot of that. The news has generally been poor, not abysmal, but poor. Right now, I would simply say the next big shoe to drop will be in Florida, I think. Florida's Supreme Court heard argument in September in a case challenging, on the basis of Florida's 1980 Constitution, the Florida 15-week law. And they're holding it, well, they've been holding it for a long time. And my sources, such as they are in Florida, tell me that don't expect it soon. The Supreme Court of Florida seems not to be in a hurry. Of course, Florida's a deep red state. But I would say it's about 50-50 what the Supreme Court of Florida will do. I say 50-50 whether that law, the 15-week law, will be upheld or not. I have to say that it's a 1980 Constitution, and there is some evidence that when it was enacted and ratified by the people of Florida, that they meant, some evidence that they meant to include the protections of Roe in their state constitution. There is some evidence for that. But I don't think that's the weight of the evidence. And I think the right decision in the Florida case, just looking at it, if you will, as a strictly legal matter or as a legal technician, I think the right answer is for the Florida Supreme Court to uphold that law. But we'll see what happens. And as I say, I'm told not to expect a decision anytime soon. But that's the big one that's out there. But it's been largely a run of bad news in state courts. Now, and there's a structural reason why that's pretty much what's going to happen, is because when it comes to state constitutional challenges, I mean, we had one in Indiana, which the big challenge we fended off. But these are pro-choice people suing to stop the enforcement or to throw out, call it what you want, a pro-choice law, a restrictive abortion law. And we've had largely poor results. And what's asymmetrical about it is in California, New York, and frankly, Illinois, where there are permissive abortion laws, there really isn't a lawsuit that's going to happen on behalf, you might say, of unborn children to challenge the liberal abortion law. So what's asymmetrical, I use that term to describe the fact that where you have permissive abortion laws, it's extremely unlikely that there could be a successful state court challenge against the permissive law on behalf in some way or in some sense of unborn children. But what we have all of the time are restrictive abortion laws challenged by pregnant women, Planned Parenthood, and those, they're not just in blue states, but they're going to be in red states because that's where the restrictive laws are. So you might say, to put it plainly, maybe too plainly, the other side gets two bites at the apple. If you're in a red state, just to put it plainly, think Indiana, you can pass a restrictive abortion law, a really good pro-life law. That's if you can get the legislature to do it. That's one bite. And the other side can oppose that effort, and that's their first chance. But then they get a chance to undo all of that political activity in the courts. And they often succeed because they'll always have a plaintiff, a pregnant woman or Planned Parenthood, and they'll make arguments that are not ridiculous, meaning they'll cite some provision of the state constitution, whatever state they're in, about inalienable rights and a right of privacy, and maybe even something that sounds like a right of bodily integrity or autonomy. So again, I'm not saying that these are sound arguments all the way through, but there's language in state constitutions, even in red states, that give a kind of sheen of plausibility to lawsuits. And the other thing is that even in red states, most judges on the high Supreme Courts are elected, even where they're appointed by the governor with the help of some commission. It's a political process. And I can tell you, I've been teaching law for 41 years. I know it doesn't look like that. I started teaching law when I was 14. It's remarkable, yes, but I don't like to brag about it. And how I spent years as a prosecutor even before that, go figure. But I've been teaching law for 41 years. Now, this is not true, I repeat, not true of Notre Dame Law School, I rejoice to say, where we've, I think, done a good job keeping its Catholic character intact. But I'm not making a point in general about Catholic character, but simply to say, apart from Notre Dame, I can tell you all of the elite schools have educated lawyers over the last 50 years since Roe. And you'd have a hard, you could get the, you might say, the pro-life faculty on the elite law schools together, and they could meet in a phone booth, if you're old enough to remember what a phone booth actually looks like. So even today's lawyers in red states, the successful lawyers, the ones with political connections to get on the state Supreme Court, were badly educated in constitutional law and civil liberties and civil rights. Now, not all of them are sort of under the stress of that bad education. Some of them have figured things out. But you can figure that the elite lawyers who get onto state Supreme Courts are going to skew purplish, even in red states. And that happened, it's been reversed since. But going back about 6 months, of all places, the South Carolina Supreme Court threw out a restrictive abortion law. And the Montana and Kansas Supreme Courts have done the same thing. So those are just examples of what I mean, is how you can have a red state, but have, at least on the abortion issue, a blue Supreme Court. So much for the state court action. One of the things, the moving target, now this occurred, or came up right about the time this article that I wrote was published in the Register. But how many of you know the Supreme Court has an abortion case on the docket? The Supreme Court, if you finished reading Dobbs, going back and forth, like I said, you would definitely come away with the impression, and that would be the impression that the Supreme Court intended to give, that the Supreme Court was like handing off the issue to the states. That's the whole vibe of the opinion, that the Supreme Court concluded in Dobbs, there is no right to abortion in the Constitution. The Constitution requires that the issue be returned to the states and representatives and the people. And the message would be that you receive is the one that was, I think, meant to give, which is that we're done. We, the Supreme Court, we're done. Being embroiled in abortion cases for 50 years was a headache, the mother of all headaches, and we've had it. Well, the Supreme Court has an abortion case now, right? It's the abortion pill case that came from Texas, where a particularly courageous judge in the Northern District, I think of Texas, Matt Kaczmarek, basically undid the FDA approval of the abortion pill. Now, the Fifth Circuit, which is the circuit where his federal court is located, is quite conservative, but even that court affirmed in part and reversed in part. Anyway, the Supreme Court's now considering what to do about the FDA's approval of the abortion pill. Now, Matt Kaczmarek, Judge Kaczmarek, threw out the original approval, I think in 2000. So that's like the sort of nuclear option for the abortion pill. Now, the Supreme Court's not taking that up. What's before the Supreme Court are much more recent adjustments, liberalizing access to the pill. I think telemedicine prescription of the pill, and I think lengthening the amount of time after pregnancy from like 7 weeks to 10 weeks. Not unimportant, but it is not the case that the pill is in the dock. I wish it were, but it's not. So the issues are important, but not seismic. And my guess, educated guess, is the Supreme Court will side with the lower courts and say that these more recent liberalizations of access to the pill are invalid. Now, the wild card, the big question, I suppose, in the area of the abortion pill is also not in front of the court in this case, although it should be, meaning there should be a case which tests, believe it or not, the present enforceability, I guess you might say the present life, the pulse of an 1871 law called the Comstock Act. There really is a law from 1871, a federal law, that banned mailing or transporting in interstate commerce. They didn't have abortion pills, but I forget what the language in the Comstock Act meant, instruments or medicines for the purpose of abortion. Now, that language has been there for 153 years, and Congress has never overruled it. Now, its enforcement was effectively suspended during the time Roe was the law. So it's not as if there's a recent history of the Comstock Act being used to suppress interstate trade in the abortion pill. But frankly, I think that it should be. I mean, unless or until Congress, Democratic Congress, decides to repeal that part of the, now you'd be waiting a long time for the Biden Justice Department to enforce the Comstock Act against anybody. And your guess is as good as mine. Just, I don't have any, well, I may not have much expertise at all, but I have no more expertise than you do about what Trump will do. What would a Trump Justice Department do? I mean, just to put it plainly again, the Comstock Act says it is a crime to transport through the mail or through I think the term in the law is common carrier, which with historical background in hand, it really means like railroads and, well, now trucks, but interstate commerce. It's a crime to transport abortion pills that way. And it could be enforced. Whether Trump would do so, I frankly doubt. I mean, leave aside whether it matters even to think worry about what Trump really thinks about anything. What he has said, is most recently, as far as I can see, about abortion, is that he might probably support a 16-week ban. And of course, the abortion pill is not used in the 16th week and beyond. Now that could change. I don't know. But I'd be surprised if Trump enforced the Comstock Act either. Now I'll make one comment about a different kind of litigation, and then end up by talking about, the IVF case from Alabama. That's actually another one of the moving targets, right? Just whatever, 10 days or so ago, the Alabama Supreme Court decided that what they called extrauterine unborn children count as persons, at least in Alabama. And I do want to talk about that. And you might say how it's becoming enmeshed in the abortion debate. But there's a small number of lawsuits that I want to just note to say that these really are frivolous and wrong-headed, and in a way, don't worry about them. But they deserve to be mentioned. And in Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, and probably a few other places that I'm not presently aware of, believe it or not, women have sued against restrictive abortion laws because the restrictive abortion laws deny them the free exercise of religion. Now, in Indiana, there's two cases, and there's a lot of women and groups, but there are Hoosier, that's what people in Indiana are, like Hoosiers, right? Don't laugh. I mean, I've lived there for 32 years. I mean, I don't assume that's common knowledge, but that's what a Hoosier is, okay? So Hoosier Jews for choice. There's an Islamic woman who's a plaintiff. Naturally, there's a Unitarian Universalist who's a plaintiff. They don't believe anything. But there are a couple of lawsuits in Indiana where the claim is, you can't deny me, this woman, that woman, an abortion, because my religion requires me to get some abortions, or at least abortions in some circumstances, which your law makes it a crime to do. So, I mean, I'm not going to read it, but the Indiana trial court upheld this claim. Indiana trial court in Indianapolis upheld this claim, saying that, this may surprise any of you present, probably not many, any Jewish people present, but the Indiana trial court concluded that Judaism mandates, not permits, mandates abortion in a whole range of circumstances. And such as those were present in this lawsuit, at least the allegation was. And Indiana didn't have a sufficient, overriding interest to defeat this claim of religious liberty. Now, that case has been argued, I think, on December 8th in an intermediate appellate court in Indiana. And I don't have any doubt that the trial court will be reversed. The Indiana appellate court, and if not there, the Supreme Court of Indiana has more sense than that. This judge also said that laws restricting abortion were based only on subjective theological opinion. That if you think people begin at conception, and you could think that, but you'd only be thinking that because of your, quote, subjective theological position. Now that's a non-starter. Even in our crazy world, secularized society, that's a non-starter. That's been tried before, going back, I think, to the late 80s, here and there, where restrictive laws were thought to be imposing Catholicism on people. But these lawsuits are liable to proliferate, and frankly, there'll probably be a couple of state Supreme Courts that buy the argument, but not many. So now let's talk about IVF, right? Catholic citizens of Illinois, well, I just did the case from Alabama about 10 days ago, big deal. The pro-choice people are playing a sort of game that delights them, a game of gotcha with pro-life politicians. They'll start with Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, and just go up and down the Republican roster. I think it's mostly Republican. How many pro-life Democrats are there in the national picture? Well, none, really. But after the IVF case, the Dems, the liberals, or whatever they are delighting in finding people like Mike Johnson, and you name them, who are on record as saying life begins at conception, and there oughtn't to be abortion for that reason. But if you hold that view, you seem to be committed to the view of the Alabama Supreme Court. You would seem, I think that is true, that is to be consistent if life begins at conception or fertilization, which I know they're not the same thing, but I think what people mean when they use the word fertilization or conception, they mean the same thing. when egg and sperm unite to form a unique new being. Whether it's called zygote or embryo at that point, I don't know, and it doesn't really matter for present purposes. But people like Mike Johnson, and frankly the Alabama legislature, which is as pro-life on abortion as you want to be, they're running for cover. They said, no, IVF is just fine by me, and I don't want to be heard to say anything negative about IVF. But of course, everybody realizes that IVF, whatever, I mean, this is not a talk about IVF, and many of you know that the Catholic Church, probably the most authoritative statement about it is all the way back in 1987, Donum Vitae, in which the IVF is morally prohibited because it amounts to manufacturing a child. I don't myself have any quarrel with that. But when you're talking about this issue in politics, what excludes, in my judgment, excludes IVF from being lawful, what's sort of morally excluding, is not exactly the prospect of making a child, although again, I'm not suggesting it's other than that, and I don't have any quarrel with the church's teaching. But the problem with IVF is that it's barbaric. I mean, at least presently, and I think for the foreseeable future, any IVF procedure involves the production of many more embryos than anybody's going to implant. And the discarding or giving up for medical experimentation, or of course, the cryogenic freezing of tiny, tiny people. That's, to me, the gravest injustice, and the reason why no decent society would permit or should permit IVF as it's practiced. Because it's been so unregulated, in America at least, I don't think anybody knows how many people, tiny people are in freezers. It seems, I'm just reading different articles in the media, I don't have any insight, so to speak, but the minimum number of tiny people in the freezer is 500,000. It's probably more than 1 million, and it could be 2 million people. But nobody knows, literally, the CDC, nobody knows for sure. So anyway, back to IVF and how it can impact, or how I think it's impacting the abortion debate. So just about the Supreme Court of Alabama, you would hear, if you read the New York Times, as I do every day, I actually pick up paper and look at it and read it. I know anybody here who's less than 40 thinks that's barbaric too, actually picking up newsprint and kind of getting it on your hands. Those of you more like my age, that's kind of what you do. Although I grew up in New York and actually made a living during high school selling the New York Times, never read it until I went to college. Okay, I went to a liberal college. And the bad habit, I've never broken. I get the Times delivered to me every day, and I do read it. Mostly, it appalls me, but I've actually broken most of the bad habits I picked up in college. I rejoice to say that. But this one I still have. But if you pick up the New York Times, you would find hysterical reporting about the Alabama decision. You would. As if there's a kind of Armageddon in Alabama. Now that's not sound, that's not correct. Now what's happened there is the Supreme Court of Alabama ruled in a case where at a place where embryos are stored, that is frozen, a patient, they say patient, so someone who's not working there, but a patient, whatever exactly that means, I'm not sure, wandered into the storage area and just took and threw on the ground and killed, because they thawed, a bunch of tiny people. So the case is about parents whose embryonic children were killed. And it's a civil case, not a criminal prosecution. And the question was whether the Wrongful Death Act in Alabama, which dates from 1872, includes these wrongfully killed little people. Now, the additional missing premise, or the key additional premise, is the Supreme Court of Alabama had already decided in early 21st century that under this wrongful death statute, unborn children count. So if you, in a car accident or some other mishap, negligently killed a pregnant woman and her unborn child, or perhaps somehow managed just to kill the unborn child where the woman survived, that unborn child is a victim. So the question was whether, the new question in this case was, you might say, whether location matters. We already know that an intrauterine child, unborn, counts for this statute. And the question was, it's a new phrase to me, extrauterine embryo counts. And I think the court reasoned correctly that, well, location doesn't matter when it comes to that question. And I think that is quite sound. Whatever it is that makes you or me or an infant, fetus, or an embryo, whatever it is that makes any of us kind of rights-bearing people or creatures who shouldn't be killed, it's got to be intrinsic and internal. It can't be that somebody wants us. It can't be because we're smart. It can't be because we're awake or asleep or not. I mean, whatever it is. Now, this leaves aside, just for discussion's sake, arguments about whether the unborn are persons. But whatever it is has to be internal to that being. And I think the Alabama Supreme Court is quite right to say, well, whatever it is that we decide, whatever it is that causes us to decide that unborn children in utero can be victims of wrongful deaths, can be wrongfully killed. It's the same if you happen to be extrauterine. I think that's quite right. Now, the Times and its ilk, people like the Times writers, went berserk because one of the other justices, one of the 7 justices, Chief Justice Tom Parker, did write an opinion that involved some theological speculation. So that's the part of the hysterical reporting that basically would make you think it's a Christian nationalism coming after you. But what Parker did, I'm not entirely sure that it was politic for him to do this in this case, and I suspect it wasn't politic. But he kind of gratuitously reflected upon what it means in the Alabama Constitution when the Alabama Constitution uses the term sanctity of life, which it does use. So that was his hook, so to speak, to wax theological. Well, sanctity means sacred. It's not the same thing as a more secular term, inviolable. Well, what would sacred mean? It means imago Dei. And there is that language in his opinion. But it's really a reflection upon the word sanctity and not any kind of part of legal reasoning. Anyway, so it seems to me I can say a few things about IVF in the abortion debate, which might be helpful. Because as I say, the other side, I don't presume to speak for you, but speaking just for myself, I say the other side in the abortion argument, is leveraging the IVF decision, and to some extent they've succeeded in getting the pro-life people, mostly Republicans, to be on the run. And of course they're already accusing the Mike Johnsons. I mean, I felt a little sorry for Johnson last night, sitting right behind Biden during the State of the Union. And he's next to Kamala Harris, who seemed to jump to her feet every 3 or 4 seconds, applauding. And Johnson looked like he needed to go to the bathroom. I mean, he spent the whole night with this kind of sour look on his face, right? And the State of the Union address went on forever, so I feel so. He probably did have to go to the bathroom. It went on forever. So, but the other side has the Mike Johnsons of the world on the run, and they'll accuse him of being a hypocrite. While you're on record as saying, when the issue was abortion, that no abortion, people begin at conception. But when the issue is IVF, you seem to forget that. I don't think that's hypocritical. I think that's inconsistent. And that's not to suggest it's a virtue. But hypocrite is like saying, you say you believe people begin at conception, but you really don't. I don't think that is the case at all. I think Mike Johnson and many, many people like him really do believe people begin at conception. But they lack a certain trait. Maybe it's courage, political courage. But whatever it is, they're acting inconsistently. That's what's happening. They really do believe when people begin is the beginning, but they're not prepared to act always consistently with it. But here's one thing to keep in mind. That has been a feature of the abortion debate from the beginning, okay, from the beginning. And on both sides, you might say. I mean, apart from the abortion context, where a woman wants to end the existence of her unborn child, even liberal people have had very little trouble admitting, well, of course, the baby is, the unborn child is a baby. It's the same as an infant. It's different when a woman wants to end the life of that child. But to just let me make more clear what I'm saying, I mean, it's at this minute, federal law, it's called the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, signed by George Bush in 2004, which makes it a federal crime to kill an unborn child, to kill the child in utero, which child in utero is defined as a member of the human species at any stage of development. Now, does anybody here remember who Scott Peterson is? Right? Now, he was a state defendant. He was in California. But he's spending the rest of his days in San Quentin, right? For doing what this law prohibits as a federal matter, right? He killed his wife Lacey and his unborn son Connor. He's convicted for 2 murders. That's in California. He's sentenced for 2 murders. That's what this law as a federal matter prohibits. And it holds that if you kill an unborn child at any stage of development, you get punished just as if you killed that child's mother. Now, I testified in Congress 2 or 3 times on this bill, in both the House and the Senate. It came back, I think I testified 3 or 4 times, but that's only because it didn't get through the first Congress in which it was proposed. So basically the same bill came back in the 103rd Congress. And here's what I said in testimony in Senate and the House both. Well, this is an anomalous thing, but this is what this federal law does. The child in utero, from the day that child comes to be, has exactly the same right not to be killed that you have, and I have, and Senator Kennedy has, and Congressman Nadel has, and everybody in this room has. Exactly the same, with one exception. The child's mother can kill it with impunity. And that's an anomaly. But that's the way it is. So that's just one thing to keep in the back of your mind, a little data point. There's nothing unusual, so to speak, about Mike Johnson or anybody else not being entirely consistent in their pro-life views. The other thing I would say when you're dealing with the use of the IVF decision in the abortion context is the IVF thing is not about abortion. Nobody aborts a 2 or 3 day old embryo. You don't even know you're pregnant. And that's how old the embryos who are in the deep freeze are. Right? There's no abortion of an embryo of the age and developmental stage of an embryo that's frozen. And you could say to somebody who's such challenging you after reading the New York Times, well, the Alabama decision, you could say, well, let's talk about that. Now, are you in favor of freezing a 15-week-old fetus? No, right? Well, why not? Well, because you don't do that. The fetus, you just don't do that, right? I mean, I think embryos are frozen at 296 degrees, minus 296 degrees. But say to the person, well, are you in favor of putting in the deep freeze a late-term fetus? Well, no, of course not. Well, why not? Well, you don't do that. Well, then let's talk about it. Let's talk about why not. Why not freeze to death a 15-week-old fetus? And eventually now this is going on the offense, right? But this is going to get the person to say, well, no, you can't do that. That's not right. That's barbaric. Okay, so let's work back. At 14 weeks, no, you can't do it. And you basically walk, I mean, and this would be my last point, it's actually, to me, I think, a perfectly sound and really the best way to argue with anyone about abortion. more specifically about the question at the heart of justice as it pertains to abortion. When do people begin? If people don't begin at the beginning, then at least early abortion is fine. But it's pretty much the way it works. You say, start wherever you want, an infant, okay? You're not going to freeze the 2-day-old baby in the next room at 296 degrees below zero. No, you're not going to do that. Well, how about it a couple of weeks before the baby's born? No, you're not going to do that. And you just walk a person back, no matter where you start. You could start, I suppose, if you had all day, would you freeze grandma at 296 degrees below zero? No. Well, how about your Aunt Tilly, her sister, who's 6 years younger? No. Well, how about me, her child? No. Well, you can walk them back. I suppose you can start any place that they're willing to agree you can't do it to the infant. And then when they get to the point where they say, no, I think you can do it then. 6 weeks, 6 days, whatever it is, you say, why? Why? What's happened? What has changed in the infant, late-term fetus, mid-term fetus, the embryo, the zygote? What has changed? And they say, well, I just think it's different. I say, well, this really matters, so let's not do it arbitrarily. So if you're in a position, you can't say you demand an explanation maybe, but you'd say, well, could we agree you can't just say, it's different because I say it's different, and I think it's different, and I feel it's different? Okay, we'll agree. Well, then tell me what has changed in that entity, that creature. And especially if you can get the person to agree, which along the way you'll get them to agree, what makes any of us valuable, a rights bearer, the kind of creature or being that can't be wantonly killed, sacrificed for somebody else's convenience, whatever that is, has to be something about us. It can't be something external. We're wanted, we're rich, we're poor, we're strong, we're smart, we have plans, we have imagination. It can't be that. It's something about us. And then you're basically demanding, so to speak, anybody who wants to be pro-choice to explain why then, what has changed in this progress or this progression from infancy back to day one. And I don't think they'll give you an answer that works. The people will give you answers. They'll say, well, you have to have plans, or you have to have interest, or you have to be able to feel pain, or whatever. You say, well, what about a 10-year-old who's anesthetized? Are they not a person? Or they say you have to have plans. Well, how about an infant? They don't have plans. You have to have like sort of emotions or imagination. You say, well, how about people who don't? So the basic structure of a totally, I think, totally sound argument about when people begin is to walk someone back like that and see if they can give you a change in that creature, entity, being, person. Which if they made that the criterion or the turning point, wouldn't exclude some walking around people. And that's, I think, what they can't actually do. They can say it's size, it's location, it's whether they're wanted, it's whether they're this or that. But if that criterion's always going to exclude some walking around people. So saddle them with the burden of explaining why, all is said and done, grandma, maybe grandma can be in the deep freeze. Or maybe some infants really do have to be disposable. Now, nobody really wants to shoulder that burden. Anyway, I've said plenty, and I'm happy to take questions or talk about Notre Dame football, which is mostly what people want to do after. I give talks like this, and people say, what about Marcus Freeman? I said, geez, I didn't say anything about Marcus Freeman, you know? I should say objection. That's beyond the scope of direct, but it doesn't seem to work. But anyway, whatever you want to talk about.
I want to thank you so much. First of all, thank you for the beautiful work. Is there anyone that wants to ask something right this moment?
Yes.
Let's think about the freezing these zygotes and embryos. They're 2 to 3 days old, and
I think 2 to 3 days.
okay, so if they're frozen at that time, that
Yeah, it's not they made the terminology of stable, so let's just say the one cell new person is called a zygote. Sometimes they say pre-embryo. I think that's Jerry made just to avoid being embarrassed if you're pro-choice, but be that as it may. My understanding is it's not a one-cell zygote that's frozen. The joining in the petri dish or whatever the lab instrument actually is 8 or 10 cells, and that's 2 or 3 days. But then, although it sounds, it is science fiction, only it's true, but it sounds like science fiction, they're frozen in the deep, deep freeze, and then the embryos can be implanted. Now, it's not foolproof. I don't have any first-hand experience with this, but I read about it enough to say with some confidence, it's hit and miss. I mean, some of the embryos don't take to the freeze and perish. Some, they attempt to implant them and it just doesn't work at all. Like it's a miscarriage, or I don't know if they say it's a miscarriage. But of course, the other, most barbaric thing probably is, I don't know at what point, it's before the deep freeze, maybe it's only when an embryo is taken out of the deep freeze and now nominated to be implanted. I don't know when, but I do know that there's a culling phase or stage where all of these tiny people are screened for defects. And sometimes, not for defects, unless you think being female is a defect, right? So they're often screened, I think they're probably always screened for defects. So rather than freeze and then implant, as these people see it, a defective kid, I mean, why would you go to all this trouble to have a kid with Down syndrome, I suppose? But I think also sex selection and maybe selection of other genetic traits are used as criteria to just discard. So it's barbaric in that kind of vivid way. But then the process is very much in the midst. But in any event, evidently, very commonly, the number of embryos created at the beginning is 20, 25. And all is said and done, the couple decides that at least 15 have no value to them. So usually they're frozen on the view that someday, maybe, they'll have a change of heart. But at least sometimes, it can work, and I guess often enough so that there are any number of IVF kids in the world. You can thaw and implant the embryo, and it certainly can work. Often does.
I think with the IVF issue, it's not just the frozen embryos, though. They implant, if I understand it right, they implant multiple embryos into the womb to see if one will take. So those that don't are also being destroyed, and there's that.
I think so.
Well,
2 or 3, not 20 or 25, but I think 2 or 3.
Right.
I think.
Multiple, and that's how some women have multiple births.
Yeah.
But it's a whole moral issue, but it's also a very emotional issue. And that's why all these politicians are supporting them, because they can't win on that. Nobody understands the dynamics or the reason why IVF would be immoral, really, from the very beginning of how those embryos are created on through the point of implantation and freezing. It's all immoral, but nobody has a clue to that.
Yeah, I think that's true. I just say quickly because other people want to talk. I teach different kinds of classes. I have a lot of friends who teach theology, philosophy, especially morals and ethics. And I think we all feel this way, even with students who are more or less well-formed, Catholic kids, for example, but good Catholic kids, or well-educated kids. Leave aside the barbarity of selective culling and sex selection embryos, which people get that. But our students, I'm talking now for a group of professor friends who have the same opinion or experience. Even well-educated, well-formed kids don't get, and if they do, they don't accept the basic church teaching about what's wrong with IVF, even if it weren't barbaric because it's abortifacient. It's laden with killing embryos, spare embryos. But Dona Vitae in 1987, it's the actually the prospect of manufacturing children coming to be not as a gift that supervenes on the marital act, but rather as a product, as the effective technique. Now that is the teaching, and it is in Dona Vitae, but I'm saying is even good kids don't get it, and if they do, they don't accept it as true. So that is an uphill climb with politicians and Kamala Harris. Could be.
I think
Yes, Lucretia.
leading right into the industry and the fact that it is operating on business principles.
Yes.
And the latest article I remember is one that Big Delight presented it on Capital, where there's a partnership between Planned Parenthood and University of California in San Diego, and they are providing embryos and to the research their medical schools, and in return, they're getting the any research that they've done, they're getting benefits. You know, if there's any patents or anything they've gotten from the research, they're getting $500. So it's a big operation.
I agree completely.
It's surpassed the moral. I don't imagine.
Well, it's a totally unregulated. I mean, you can see that in even discussions about the Alabama case. It's been a totally unregulated business that is IVF fertility clinics. I think scandalously unregulated, and it is a big business. And we've missed the boat on that, so to speak. I'm not sure how much could have been done in the past to regulate it, even to enact some prohibitions or limitations on the process itself. But I will say, I'm about as pro-life as you want to be, I think. I can't say I've had that many battles over IVF. I mean, I have focused on abortion, to be honest with you. And to euthanasia comes second, and ignored. Well, in my own work, I suppose, IVF. So the pro-life movement has, missed its chance, I suspect, to do anything really useful. I don't myself, I'm not optimistic about regulating, leave aside the Alabama case and politics, I don't think there's much prospect, in America at least, of seriously curtailing the use of IVF. Now, one thing I'll mention, and you don't know, well, maybe you're old enough to remember, but maybe you don't. About 20 years ago, we were really worried about cloning. Around 2003, 4, 5, cloning was coming, and the kind of, we were, people who were worried about it, I suppose, even if you were in favor of it, you were projecting a huge industry in cloned people who could be mined for spare parts, who could be mined to reproduce your genetically identical arm or liver. Now, we've dodged that bullet for the time being. And as far as I know, looking at the whole big world, I don't think there's any cloned person walking around. A clone that was implanted and came to be. But again, that just means we've dodged the bullet. It doesn't mean it'll stay that way. So we may have to face that and the whole prospect of truly and deeply manufactured people at some point. So we're going to need to have a clear head about when do people begin, what makes them valuable. And I should say, I think it's implicit in what I've said, or apparent in what I've said, even if you come to be by IVF or come to be by cloning, you're a person like me and you. I mean, if you survive the gauntlet in the lab and get implanted after being frozen for 10 years, you're a person just like me and you. Jesus died for that person the same as he died for us. That person is my brother or sister. You're the same, even if you did come to be through morally illicit means.
I work for a company that houses medical records, and so we house advanced fertility university. I got a religious exemption from communicating with them. I didn't want my name on it, promoting the business and B.A plan, on the B plan, he did infiltrate the sporting events. Well, he ended up giving a lot of his sperm banks. He's got like 60 kids out there that are related to him.
Muy macho, right?
Yeah, and they said they actually had got this system on there and said, well, the problem is that you might have a brother and sister meet each other and get married, and there's some genetic issues. And one thing about Mike Johnson, and this is my question, Mike Johnson and was Karen Bradler from Alabama.
Yeah.
They're Christians, but they're Protestant Christians. And I know from talking to my evangelical Protestant friends, it's like they have no clue on what. I'll ask them, what's your church's stance on IVF? And they don't know. Some will say it's okay, some say, well, I'm not sure, maybe not. And so you can see kind of the difference between Catholic Christianity versus Protestant Christianity.
I agree completely. I think that's quite right. You can see the holes or weak spots in Protestant theological ethics. And even really solid people, two or three that I'm thinking of right now, since the Alabama case, Andrew Walker is one, who writes, I think, often enough to pop up on the Ethics Public Policy Center website. But I know a couple or three people like Andrew, who is a serious and sound man, and is inclined to think there is something wrong with IVF, but has no idea why. Except to the extent he just borrows, if that's the right term, from Catholics. Yes, sir.
These children and IVF, are they healthy children? Have they been around long enough to know?
I believe so, yeah. Now, this is what you can read in the paper. The paper said, the New York Times says, 2% of the births in America in a given year now, probably for some period of time past, 2% are IVF kids. I suspect that's not true. That's an advocacy number. But I suspect that the number is quite large, and it's my understanding, which is pretty shallow of this part of what I'm talking about today, is that IVF kids are very likely to be fine. And partly because those who might not look like they're going to be fine don't make it to the finish line at all. But I think IVF kids are fine. You know, physically and mentally, whatever. Now, whatever means to you emotionally and psychologically, to know you were conceived in a petri dish and whatever, I don't know. I would be guessing as to how that affects a person psychologically. Yeah.
Question about divorce and custody issues.
Yeah.
That's becoming so popular. Can you be compelled to bring them to life, or who gets them when they get divorced, or how does that work?
It's been something that's been in and out of courts for quite some time now. Not that you need to know the name of the case, but the case that people begin talking about when they talk about this, Davis v. Davis in the Tennessee Supreme Court. I think it's 1988 or so. But there are a lot of cases like that. Even unmarried people who are partners, or unmarried people who are not even partners, but they have embryos. In general, the courts except in Alabama, treat them as marital property. The embryos are marital property. But even that doesn't hold, because you can't really think that they're property, like the car or the furniture. So that, because the embryos can be activated and become your child. So in general, maybe there are exceptions, but the general trend is no one should be made a parent like against their will. So if the two people freeze an embryo, then they break up. And let's say years later, the woman said, I want to go into the freezer and now gestate that child because I don't have any other kids or a kid died. In general, if the husband objects and says, I don't want you to be able to do that, the husband will prevail on the view he should not be made to be a daddy. You might say against his will. So the picture is a moral norm of consent is being put to work there. And that's the general move. I don't have a strong opinion about such a bizarre situation.
Do they destroy them then, or do they?
They usually are just kept in a deep freeze, like in oblivion. Now it costs money. Now I gather that if you don't pay your rent, the lab discards them. But anyway, as far as I read, they stay in the freezer. I mean, I'm just guessing now, but it makes sense that it's true that there are tiny people who have been frozen for 30 and 40 years with no prospect of anything else.
Has it ever been litigated that, that inconsistency where the mother kills her child with impunity, but then someone else doesn't? I mean, hasn't that been someone that would sue and say, I'm being discriminated against, type of thing?
It has. I'll just take the example of the Young Women Victims of Violence Act, which is the federal law. I testified on it, and actually was passed. I usually fight losing battles. I specialize in that. But in any event, so let's take that as an example. Now, the generic form of that law is feticide. And about 38 states have feticide laws. They don't all penalize as murder, let's say, killing an unborn child from day one. That is what the federal law does. Member of the human species at any stage of development. Now, the reason that has nothing to do with IVF is that the law actually says in utero. If it didn't say that, and let's say I didn't actually help draft that law, although maybe I helped a little bit. But if we had been, let's say I helped a little bit to draft the law. If I had been thinking about IVF, you might have left out in utero. And then that law would apply to what happened in Alabama when someone destroys embryos. But anyway, get back to the main point. So you have a feticide law of the Young Women Victims of Violence Act. And what a few men have done, they're the husband or the boyfriend, but in any event, the father of the child. And they are in a situation where, and I can think of names, maybe one case I'll talk about is a man named Weldon in Florida. But basically it's the guy who ends up, I guess, contraceptive failure, unexpectedly is told, we're having a baby. And he doesn't want any part of it. And then maybe tries to talk her into getting an abortion, and that doesn't work. So now he's left, well, I'm not being a daddy. So what am I going to do? Well, Weldon in Florida, to make a good illustration of the asymmetry here, and he tried in court to argue against this situation, but he actually had the same reasons. He said he had the same reasons for not wanting to be a daddy that are usually attributed to women who get abortions. I have no money, I have no prospects, our relationship is done, and I'm emotionally fragile. I can't handle it. Now that would be a kind of classic explanation for an abortion, right? But she said, no, tough. So what he does then, his father's a pharmacist, he gets his father to order the abortion drug from Canada, the abortion cocktail. Gets it, puts it in her vial of what she thinks is like her medicine or her prescription. So the woman ends up taking the abortion pill and then miscarries, whatever, 2 days later. Just as she would, in terms of what it looks like, if she had an abortion of her own. So here you have someone with the same motive, the same means, the same instrument of doing away with his child, and he goes to jail for 20 years. She could do the same thing, exactly the same thing, and it's fine. He says in court, and there have been a few other people who did this, in Pennsylvania, made the same law, said, you can't do that to me. That violates my rights of equal protection of the law. And I'll leave aside the fancy footwork of the legal argument, but the legal argument actually is sound. But the courts don't allow it to go forward. Now, these are cases that happened before Roe. But there are a few cases, Weldon in Florida, Prologue in Pennsylvania, but they say, you can't send me to jail for 20 years for doing what she could do, and it doesn't matter at all. It's perfectly up to her. And the courts don't have a reason to say no. They just say no. So both in Florida and the Pennsylvania case I'm thinking of, and I've read the opinion of the court, all they say is, oh, you're saying that it's inconsistent with the Constitution for her to have a right to abortion under Roe. And the courts just say, I'm not going to allow that. I'm not accepting that. They don't have a reason, because the argument actually is compelling, but they're not going to have any business. They're just not going to put up with it. One thing about the feticide laws, it's Scott Peterson's in San Quentin, and You don't want to be in San Quentin, believe me. But the new phase of the feticide prosecution saga is the first person, to my knowledge, is going to be executed for feticide. He's in Alabama. Jesse Lavelle Phillips is on death row in Alabama. And the only reason he's there is because he committed capital murder, as opposed to like ordinary everyday murder. He committed capital murder because there were 2 victims, multiple victims, 2 or more, his girlfriend and his baby. So the only reason he's going to be executed is the presence of the unborn child, whose status as a homicide victim is identical to the status of the mother. Now, he would have a pretty good argument. You can't do that to me. You can't kill me for killing my unborn child. I don't want to be a daddy against my will. And what he should say is, I'll accept assault charges or even homicide charges against the mother. I have to accept that. But what you can't do is kill me because of the presence of the baby inside her. You did?
Yeah, on this regulation issue, we have a friend and a colleague in Italy who said, and this is a number of years ago, that they, as I recall what she said, they regulate IVF.
I think it's just married couples can do it.
And maybe that's part of it, but I also think she said that they can only produce 1 embryo at a time. It has to be implanted, and if it doesn't take, you have to go through the whole process again, which makes it very expensive, which I think is part of the reason why they just produce multiple, like you said,
Correct.
15 here. Do you know
Correct.
if that's still the law in Italy, or?
I think it is. And I want to try to say this exactly as I want to say it. If you had, I'm just going to call it something, clean IVF, meaning it's between a married couple and there's no collateral damage, meaning no embryos discarded. That, I'm not saying it's right, it is wrong. I'm not myself sure it should be illegal. Like, in other words, a decent society has to act to protect even the tiniest people. And that's why I think I said earlier words to the effect, that to me is what's morally disqualifying. Even in a pluralistic liberal society, you can't have IVF as presently practiced because it's homicidal. It's a murder, mayhem, rage. But if you had the clean case, and what was wrong was the production of a person rather than conceiving a person through marital act, I'm not sure that a decent society has to make that illegal. I think a decent society could tolerate it.
Immoral, but not illegal.
Well, a lot of things that we tolerate are immoral. Yeah, I'm just saying, I don't think it's any less immoral. It is less immoral because it's not immoral for 2 or 3 additional reasons. But the main thing that makes it immoral about its kind of compromise of the marital act and all of that, I think a decent society might tolerate. I mean, we tolerate lots of immorality, and we should. I mean, if your siblings lie to each other, they shouldn't do that. I don't want the cop knocking on the door, taking out 2 of my kids in handcuffs. I mean, that's just, So, I mean, it may sound bold when I first say it, and maybe even sounds wrong, but a good society, even a just society, tolerates tons of immorality, and they should. And the society should. I mean, we don't want to think that everything that's wrong should be the government's business, much less a government crime. No, I'm not in favor of immorality, but I am in favor of privacy, if you want to call it that. Any more questions? Jim? Yes, sir.
Is there a precise term for those people that use the law as anything they can get away with? Even you gave the example.
Yeah, lawyer.
People have no reverence for the law. They create a new religion, Jews for pro-choice or something.
Yeah.
When you're in debate with other professors of the law and judges, you must, I'm guessing, have a term for those people that turn the law on its ear in order to get what they want.
Yeah, I suppose the somewhat more elegant term is sophistical. All the sophistical arguments are ones that have an appearance of validity, but are just overly clever sophist. I suppose that's the right word. I say lawyer kind of half jokingly. But I think that's what you get a lot of, sophistical arguments, but also that have an appearance of validity, but they're really not valid. But a lot of times, maybe increasingly, when I debate, I debated, it was a thankless task, I have to say, debated same-sex marriage for years, even before people even thought it was an issue. Started debating and writing about same-sex marriage in the mid-90s. But often with that issue, and to some extent with abortion, people they just say, I don't accept what you're saying, what Bradley is saying. I don't accept it. And I'm not going to let you impose what you're saying on me. And in any event, it's just your Catholicism. So they're not arguments. That's like saying, just shut up. That's pretty much what it amounts to, shut up. Now that's a power. That's you see it verbalized, but it's just power. And I think I'm seeing more and more of that, just power. You don't get people, not in any kind of like parlor with, aperitifs, kind of reasoning slowly. I'm not talking about something that's fantastical or even a Platonic seminar, but it used to be. Here's an example, pertinent to what we're talking about today. I would have debate abortion over the years, and you could get a pro-choice person to debate with you about the status of the unborn. They would say something about why they don't think, as I do, that people begin at conception. You would write articles about, no, people do begin at conception. The arguments against that view are invalid, here's why, and here's why I think it's the deal. And they would write back. Frankly, when's the last time you heard anybody on the pro-choice side discuss or even mention the unborn child? I honestly have never heard Joe Biden. He's a curious example. I don't encounter people, including Obama, for example, who actually talk about the unborn child. The most you get are these totally depersonalized terms. The nouveau term is occupant of the womb, which is pretty impersonal, So, but I would say, and I say this most sincerely, it's not exaggerated, I'm not trying to be flippant, which is one of my tendencies. People in writing and in conversation, when you talk about abortion, the other side simply will not engage in an argument. Like the one I rehearsed earlier. Let's start with an infant, or we can start with grandma. Take longer, we can walk back from grandma to when she was an infant. Now, and this is what, frankly, those of us who, I've been privileged to be part of the pro-life legal movement for a long time, and those of us who kind of helped to cook up the partial birth abortion bans from around like 1996 to 04, and they were really meant to make a point. I don't think there were many partial birth abortions, and if there were, I guess they were banned. But the point was, now, could we agree that whatever you think about when people begin, it can't be that when someone's halfway out of the womb, they don't count, but then a second later and 8 inches later, when they're out of the womb, they count just like me and you? Can we agree that that can't make any sense, right? And that was really the point of the partial birth abortion, that can't be right. It is sound. That can't be right. That location, partly in, partly out. Then you'd say, okay, so now it's the mother is in the delivery room, the baby's entirely inside her womb. But it's 9 months, the baby's fully formed. Now it's open season on that child if you're the mother. Right? Well, no. If the baby's in the birth canal, no, they count like us. No. They have to be all the way out. But that actually, if you have anything approaching decency, sounds ridiculous. And it is ridiculous. But I guess what I'm saying is, now I think we're encountering power and a lot of lies. It's a different talk, and Ellen will have to invite me back. One of my new losing battles is the transgender thing. But you can see already it's unraveling it as a lie. talking about kids and child abuse. I mean, I think we're always going to have Caitlyn Jenner, guys who like to dress up like girls. That's a different weird thing. But I'm talking about what's happening with kids and the puberty blockers, cross-sex hormone and surgeries. I think that's child abuse. And it's beginning to unravel as a big lie. My point is, it's gotten this far as a big lie because pharma and people with deranged views of gender identity, adults who wish they had had surgery before them, somehow it became something that a big segment of our politically active class of people adopted as like their new cause. And it's a big lie. But that's an example of just power. It's powered by lies.
As a lawyer, I was wondering, when you look back on Europe and like Spain was even kind of country and the church was the one that was
Yeah.
And now you look at our country, how much, does that make more sense now? So like all this law going on, and how much are we to blame as Catholics for not changing the electorate by barely incorporating it?
Well, that's a tough question. I mean, I've done my part. I have 8 children and 17 grandchildren, so I'm doing what I can to repopulate the country with Catholics. I don't know. I mean, I don't have I should avoid being flip again. But what Catholic political power could have been, but wasn't in America over, let's just say, my lifetime. I mean, I've seen that political power change radically. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, I didn't understand, as a kid, I didn't really understand it, but I do kind of remember when the second most powerful politician, like in New York City, was Cornell Spellman. And maybe sometimes if the mayor was a weak figure, the first most powerful politician in New York City was Cornell Spellman. That's all gone. The sex abuse crisis had a lot to do with it. But I think that's a serious question about what opportunities were lost for lack of will, courage, foresight, clarity of thought. And I think that's probably is a significant loss there for which we can be blamed. Going forward, I'm not optimistic about anything. Repopulating maybe. I don't think there's much prospect. I mean, I think the church has lost so much of its moral authority. It's hard to see how that can be recovered in the short run. And I don't think there's any such thing anymore as a Catholic vote. I mean, they used to be. But I don't think there's such a thing as a Catholic vote. And I don't even think, in this election cycle, despite whatever, said to be a devout Catholic. But it's not that long ago when you could see, and the pundits would talk about, whether it's Trump in 16 or whatever, 2000, McCain. Not that long ago when you would hear people talk about it, and they really meant it to be serious. He's angling for the Catholic. The politicians are thinking, what do I need to do to appeal to the Catholic vote? I don't think anybody even thinks that way anymore.
Can we state our nation state with all pluralism we have on life? Our nation state that has kind of like, because we always have to deal with consideration for the state. So, first thing you could find country has one side. Instead of all these legal cases, just won't pass what I mean.
I don't know. I actually do believe in separation of church and state. Not what the Supreme Court has meant by it over the last whatever, which has been secularism. But I do believe in the separation of church and state.
So that
Yeah. Anyway, probably something not that.
Thank you so much, because you could never say enough, frankly.
Oh.
And you began to go in areas that I think we are all very eager to hear you talk about another time. It's really important. We don't want to wait too long, because the other thing about what precedes is the rapid change